Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. W.F. Strong.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and we have an exciting book to talk about today. We're going to talk to the author of this wonderful new book called Crowdsourced Health, published by MIT Press, a very high-quality publication and a great cutting-edge book. And some of this is going to blow your mind today. You're going to be really surprised at what is possible in terms of health on the internet. We have with us today Dr. Elad Yom-Tov. I'm going to jump right in here because I want to talk about what exactly is crowdsourcing. Let's start with the big picture. What is crowdsourcing on the net?
Okay, so crowdsourcing is this term that was given to the idea that instead of perhaps doing something by yourself or inside a company, you hire people outside of the company, the crowd, as it were, to help you achieve it. The first example was trying to assess the weight of a bull in a market in England, where each person sort of guessed the weight of the bull. Each of them were wrong to a certain extent, but the average was actually very accurate. And so this idea of listening to what people think or donate to you, and then using that as information is what we call crowdsourcing.
Now, you got the information for this book based upon the fact that you work for Microsoft Research and you've worked for Yahoo, right?
Yes, so part of this information. When we talk about crowdsourced health, what we actually mean is this idea of using the information that people put online, whether intentionally or not, to learn something about health and medicine. And some of this information is privileged in the sense that it's considered to be quite sensitive, and so it is only available if you work for one of the companies that, say, operate a search engine such as Yahoo or Microsoft or Google. Other information is more readily available online if you look at things like patient forums or social media, Twitter, Facebook, things like that.
But just to be clear, you aren't looking at individuals' data. You're looking at universal or collective data, right?
Exactly. So for reasons of privacy, we're very careful not to look at individual people's data, but to look at things like aggregates of data from many people. And also, just to make sure that we don't actually breach the privacy of people, when we have access to the data, they are already masked so that we can't identify individual people, and we don't want to do that.
Are there a lot of people now using Google as their doctor?
The vast majority of Internet users who have a health problem go online to try and understand more about it. I can't say how many of them use it as a doctor in the sense that this will be their one and only point at which they will search for information, but many of them use it to get an initial assessment of what might be the problem, or to reinforce what they hear from their physician, or maybe to go to their physician knowing already what might be the problem.
Okay. And you point out in the book that a lot of times when people have certain symptoms, instead of going to the doctor, they go to the internet first. Like if they're having chest pain or whatever, they'll go to the internet to see what this might be, right?
Yes, exactly. And actually, you mentioned chest pain, which is a great example because, of course, people who experience chest pain should go to the emergency room because it might actually be something like a heart attack. But one of my colleagues saw that actually it takes a very long time between when people search for something like a heart attack and until they actually go and visit a hospital, much longer than what doctors recommend.
How do you know that? How do you know that they search and then there's 3 hours before they go to the emergency room?
So in that case, they were looking for the time between when people asked or searched for things related to chest pain, and until the time that they searched for things like where is the nearest hospital.
Oh, I guess that's a clue for sure, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So, so crowdsourcing health, to me, it works in two ways, at least from reading your book. Before I read your book, I thought of crowdsourcing health as something that epidemiologists were doing. You know, they'd say, okay, there's been so many searches for flu in Dallas, so we can tell that there's a flu outbreak in Dallas and it's moving west, or something like that. That's what I thought crowdsourcing health was all about. And they do that, right?
Right. So one part of crowdsourcing health is exactly what you mentioned, is this idea that epidemiologists can either monitor what's happening in the population or perhaps ask questions about public health that these data can help them answer. The other is the more personal stuff that we actually look at, and some of it is also mentioned in the book. For example, when we look at people's searches, and for those people who are at risk for things like mood disorders, we can say ahead of time, look, you might be heading into the direction of something like a mood disorder event. Or again, one of my colleagues looked at those people who at some point in time were diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And he was able to go back in time and say, well, actually, we could have known with some probability, with some likelihood, that they had this cancer already by looking at their questions.
Well, that's a very interesting thing. So you can track the queries on search engines to determine progression of things.
Exactly. And one of the first pieces of work that we did was to look at adverse reactions of drugs. So a lot of times, if you read the instead of a package of pharmaceuticals, you'll see that it causes, multiple adverse reactions. So a lot of bad things can happen, but often they don't actually happen. But what we looked at was those people who asked about a drug, and then sometime later they asked about something which might be an adverse reaction. So they asked about a drug when it was prescribed to them by their doctor, and then sometime later they asked about, say, a headache. Mm-hmm. Now, if just a single person or a very small number of people asked about this combination of drug and then headache, that doesn't really tell us a lot. But if we see many people, meaning thousands or tens of thousands of people who made these pair of searches, more or less in the same time difference as well, so it might be 2 months later or a few days later, then maybe we have something here that tells us that this is related to the drug, so that this headache is maybe caused by this drug, and this should be investigated further.
Well, one of the things that I find promising in your research is the idea that we are getting essentially behavioral data instead of what you might call self-report data. A lot of times when patients report things, they remember wrong or they exaggerate or whatever, but this is based upon how they're feeling at the moment that they search.
Exactly. And this example of the adverse reactions of drugs is exactly this example, right? So if you take a drug and you experience a side effect, you expect the side effect to appear maybe a few days or within a few hours of when you start taking the drug. And so if that happens, then people a lot of times will go back to their physician or will report it to the FDA. However, if it takes maybe a few weeks or a few months for the side effect to appear, people don't really make this association between the side effect and the drug, and they don't report it to the authorities. Whereas for us, we don't actually need them to self-report. All we need for us to see a sufficiently large number of people who make these pairs of searches, and we can make the association for them.
Very cool. What about this relationship between the bipolar person and their moments where they kind of lose control of their bipolarness and from their searches, you're able to tell that they lost control because of pornography and what other things?
So the way that it worked there was we looked at people who were asking about drugs that are used to treat mood disorders. We can't actually go to people and ask, do you have a mood disorder? So we had to infer somehow whether their when in time do they have something like a manic episode or a depressive episode. And so what we looked at was, when do they behave in a way that's unusual? And one of the things that we saw was that around the time that they asked about their medicines, a lot of time they will start behaving very differently from their normal behavior. And we saw a couple of things. One, as you mentioned, is a much larger consumption of pornography. The other was a lot of online shopping. And then to see if this was actually a good indicator of something like a manic episode, we conducted a survey among people who were unrelated to the data that we had, but people who did have mood disorders. And we asked them, what do you do when you have a manic episode? And some of them did actually say, we search for pornography, and others said, we do a lot of unnecessary online shopping. So that, among other indicators, told us that actually we have identified when they have a mood disorder event. And then what we did was we went back in time and again asked, could we have identified this ahead of time? And it turns out that we could actually have identified this a few hours or up to a day before they actually experienced it.
Well, I was reading that research, I started thinking about the notion of developing, prescriptive type of prophylactics or prophylactic apps that you could kind of intercede with people before they had full-blown episodes of whatever. And then you went to the notion of this company that had developed a kind of suicide prevention app. And so I said, oh, well, there it is. But then you said there's issues with that. Talk about that, the suicide app. I know it doesn't have that name, but what is it?
So this app was developed by an NGO called the Good Samaritans. And what they did was they asked people to install it on their phones, and it would monitor your friends on Twitter or the social networks to see whether they were using phrases that were indicative of depression. And if they identified one of these phrases, they would tell you, look, your friend so-and-so was using this phrase, and maybe you want to talk to them so they don't act on their depressive tendencies.
Right.
This turned out to be quite a bad idea for several reasons. One of them is privacy. So people felt very strongly that you were essentially breaching their privacy by telling them something about what their friends were doing, where they didn't really ask you to do this for them. And the other was that the app was quite naive in the phrases that it was looking at. So you may use the same language to describe something that is perhaps indicative of depression, but it could also be cynicism, or you could be joking, or a bunch of other types of usage of language, and so it wasn't accurate enough.
Well, a lot of prototypes are failures, but they lead us to something better down the road. So maybe it's a nice try that will teach us. Right? Definitely.
I think there is, in future, a market for these kinds of apps where perhaps you will go to your doctor, they will prescribe you a drug, but also an app which will help you get the most out of your drug.
Now, another thing that I think I know people use the internet for is for, sharing information, finding information they can't otherwise get, and for finding soulmates suffering from whatever their issue is. I know for me that I use the internet for health issues because the doctor doesn't have time to sit there and talk to me for 30 minutes. I'm lucky to get 3 or 4 minutes. So I go to the internet for more information and jargon-free information that's not, laced with the jargon of medicine that I can't follow. So I want it in real plain language, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And as you point out, I didn't ever heard of this site, but it was really quite fascinating to hear about it. You said that people with ALS have a site, or at least it was originally created for them, called A Patient Like Me. What is it called?
Yep, yeah, exactly.
A Patient Like Me. And so it was put to pull together all the people with ALS so they could share their approaches to dealing with that illness. And then you said it blew out from there to many, many things, and it has how many millions on it now?
I don't remember offhand, but it is several millions of patients with some of them chronic diseases, some of them more acute diseases. But ALS is a very good example, and this is one of the reasons that it started there, because it has a relatively clear progression. And so if you're a patient with ALS, a lot of times you want to find somebody who's relatively similar to you or maybe slightly down the line to see what you can expect in terms of your progression. And again, maybe they found something that was beneficial or helpful in some way, and you want to know about this. And ALS is certainly not the only example. And so now so many other people use it to describe their condition and to describe not only their very specific medical experience or medical needs, but also everything else, their mental health or their experience with their physicians and so forth. And this is very beneficial to other people who are suffering from similar diseases.
And then this is where you really blew my mind, is that you talked about how people with anorexia created sites for people with anorexia so they could meet and talk. And what happened is this got turned on its head, that the original purpose got twisted.
Yes, so a lot of times when we think about medical communities on the Internet, we think about the positive, like you mentioned, patients like me. But for certain, especially for certain mental conditions, such as eating disorders and anorexia specifically, these communities are not designed to help patients get better. Instead, they're designed to help them maintain their condition or even make it worse by, say, providing them tips on how to deceive their social environment, their families and their friends, into thinking they're eating when they're not, or how to starve yourself better, in a sense. And so I was very interested in these communities, first of all, to understand what their effect was, but then to see whether all these communities were alike. And we did actually, with more recent research, find that there were some communities where, even though they were designed to help people maintain their condition, actually they help them slightly improve over time. And so they're not all equal. Some are worse than others.
You gave me a term I'd never heard of before, Thinspiration, sites of Thinspiration. Wow.
So apparently, and I'm no expert in this, but the experts I talk to tell me this, that anorexia, which essentially is starving yourself, is very hard to do. Mm-hmm. The body is designed to seek food when it needs it. Mm-hmm. And so these patients will look for advice and tips on how to starve themselves, but also they will look for inspiration from other people or very underweight celebrities or models that will inspire them in their quest. And this is this type of Thinspiration content, which we looked at quite closely.
Yes, you pointed out that you could predict who was likely to be suffering or soon to be suffering from anorexia by virtue of their searches for celebrities that rated high on the anorexia index, right?
Yes. So in that case, we were actually thinking about a law that was passed in Israel several years ago. And the law said that advertisers were not allowed to use photographs of highly or very underweight celebrities and models in their advertisements. And that was, I think, a world first. Mm-hmm. But nobody really knew whether these underweight models inspire other people to lose weight in the way that makes them sick with anorexia. Now, if you were to try and answer this kind of question without our data, without internet data, you would have to conduct a very expensive, very long-term study in the physical world. Whereas for us, we could do essentially two things. We could look at people who, by virtue of their queries, we think with a very high likelihood that they have an eating disorder or will soon have an eating disorder. And then we, again, go back in time and ask, which celebrities did they look at online just before or in the months before they developed this eating disorder? Mm-hmm. And that's when we found that, yes, indeed, if there's a favorable depiction of certain celebrities who are known to be suffering from an eating disorder, then that favorable depiction will translate into development of an eating disorder in some of our users.
And who are the celebrities that rate high on this index?
I don't have it in front of me right now, but when we looked at the highest rated celebrities, so what we did to identify these celebrities was we looked at how many people, when they mentioned this celebrity, also mentioned things like anorexia or anorectic. Mm-hmm. When we then went and looked at the top people in this list, we saw that most of them either publicly identified as having an eating disorder, or at least there were very strong rumors that they did have these kinds of eating disorders.
So these celebrities in the world of anorexia are role models.
Exactly. What we think is happening is that when you have a very underweight celebrity shown on mainstream media, and that celebrity is depicted in a way that is highly positive, so, here's a celebrity and she's very beautiful. If that has the influence on some of our users, some people, to say, well, if that's my role model, and the only way to get there is by starving myself, then that's what I'll do. But the opposite was also very interesting, because we found that when that celebrity was shown, they were also mentioned that they were sick with anorexia, then very few, if any, people develop these kinds of eating disorders. And this is a phenomenon that's quite similar in other areas, such as suicide, that when you say, here's a positive role model, some people will try to imitate them. If you say, here's a person, but they're not a role model, they're sick, people don't want to be sick, and so they don't imitate.
Well, I was also surprised by the number of people on some of these sites that you said would... I guess it's you might call it the Facebook effect, where you get instant applause for things, and so they would post pictures of themselves with showing their collarbones and their ribs showing, and then they get people to say, "Oh, that looks marvelous," and so they get egged on, so to speak, in their anorexia by these sites. Unfortunately,
exactly, and that's why they're there, right? So in a sense, it's working for them, because they are posting these kinds of pictures on these websites so that they get the social support, and indeed they do get it.
Well, so we have the good and the bad. We have the people who find each other for support against a cardiac condition or something that by associating with others online and becoming friends or buddies, they are a support system. And then you have those that support each other in their downward spiral, which I like something you pointed out. You said it used to be that anorexic people were so rare that they didn't know each other. They might not know anybody else who was anorexic, but the internet gave them a chance to find each other and to find out and to validate each other, really.
Yes, But as you say, there's a very negative angle to this, in the sense of patients with anorexia. There's also a very positive one. There are these very rare diseases where you have a few tens or a few hundreds of patients all over the world, and now they have communities where they can discuss their problems, where they can say who are the specialists, who has seen enough patients that they can help with their condition. And so for these people, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to focus on the negative. It just surprised me. The anorexia spiral downward was a very big surprise, but certainly I would assume that overwhelmingly the crowdsourcing health is a positive thing. People get more information, they get more support, they get healthier.
Yes, I agree. And especially I think it's true that for younger people who may not feel comfortable, say, going to their parents with problems that they want to discuss, a lot of times for them, this is actually very positive because they can find somebody with expertise online and ask them without perhaps having to not ask this question because they feel embarrassed. But of course, again, there's always risk in this kind of behavior.
Sure. Now, your research is using the Bing search engine. Is that where you get your data?
We use a variety of data. Okay. So Bing is one source of data that we use, and those are the searches that people conduct with Bing, and we have, as I said, anonymous access to them. We also use social media, so things like Twitter, Yahoo Answers is a very good source that we use, but sometimes we'll use things from Wikipedia or from photo sharing sites.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. So okay, thought I lost you there a second. And you were pointing out that Yahoo Answers and I think Twitter are more likely to give you unedited or more valid responses because people feel they have anonymity?
Yes, so especially for something like health, which is so sensitive,
sure,
people don't feel very comfortable posting their questions on media which is not anonymous. So something like Facebook, where you're known by your full name, people will feel less comfortable posting a medical question, whereas something that's semi-anonymous, such as Twitter, or fully anonymous, such as Bing, you will get every kind of health behavior that you can think about.
Well, I tell you, I wish we had more time because this is fascinating. I think we'll just have you come back again for another 30 minutes because there's so much to dig into here. But I think we got a nice start. And
it will be a pleasure.
So, is there? We have about 2 minutes. Anything you would like to say in terms of your total research here? Any kind of final thought?
I think our research doesn't replace medical research. It's another tool that I want to put in front of medical researchers and patients and doctors and say, here's something that you could use which doesn't actually exist in other forms of medical research. And over the years, we've found that this kind of data can help in certain areas, and we talked about them in the past half hour. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's another tool in the toolbox, and the reason for writing my book was actually to get patients and doctors more engaged, understand that this data is out there, and maybe come back to us, the computer scientists, and say, let's think of another question or another research project that we should do together.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We've been talking to Elad Yom-Tov about his book, Crowdsourcing Health. A wonderful book. You want to pick it up. You want to read it. I promise you, you'll love it. For Good Books Radio and for audiobooks.com, I've been your host today, Dr. W.F. Strong. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.